Welcome to Duncan Toplis On Air. I'm Caroline Cleary, Marketing Director at Duncan Toplis, and in today's episode I'm joined by Steve Bedford from Conical. We're going to explore our mutual interest in the legal sector. And might be worth starting off today by talking about what you've experienced in the sector over the last 12 to 36 months, I suppose, because it's been quite a changing world.
Yeah, well, obviously we can't ignore the pandemic. That made a lot of people think about what they were doing and how they were doing it as well. But also we're seeing law firms going through a period of rationalisation, considering what services they should be offering and how they offer them to the marketplace. But at the same time, we're seeing a degree of organisational rationalisation as well, and an increasing emphasis on branding, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose one of the big questions for people like us is, how does marketing strategy fit within law firms at the moment? And as with all businesses, there's challenges around marketing strategy and what that means. But what are you seeing in the marketplace?
Well, in terms of the strategy formulation process, I think that in itself is quite interesting, because I think a lot of professional service firms, let alone law firms, have been very good at forecasting, looking at their WIP, looking at operational issues, and not necessarily looking at strategic issues. And I think that's changing a little bit now. And I think the law firms in particular are looking at the marketplace for the different services. So on one side, you might have something like wills and probate services, very much a consumer offering, all the way through to something maybe very technical like corporate finance. And at that stage, the marketplace is very much a B2B one. So law firms have got a bit of a challenge, because they've got to deploy consumer marketing techniques, but also high-value B2B techniques as well.
Do you feel that law firms are really getting to grips with defining their business in terms of their identities, in terms of their purpose, their value, the things that are really helping to drive consumer and business choice at the moment? Because of course, people buying from people, whether it's a business choice or whether it's for you as an individual, you're often using those same triggers, those same processes. So how do you feel identity is, particularly in like the SME market, with rather than the larger law firms?
Yeah, I think the mid-sized firms have a particular challenge, and that's that they historically have been set up as partnerships. They often have a very departmental focus. Maybe their objectives have been set on a departmental basis as well, which means they have the potential to operate in silos. And that's not something that doesn't, it's something that exists in other professional service firms as well. But I think for law firms in particular, they've been looking at that. Cross-selling has always been one of those kind of holy grail things. Maybe not calling it selling, but cross-referral within a firm. But the concept of what the firm stands for, what its brand values are, is something that has been neglected. And I think it's only now are we really beginning to get into that with the mid-sized firms in particular.
And I think that leans into culture, which is something only 5 and a bit years into my professional services journey I found really interesting. And that the topic that I talk around is about individualism. Individualism is really powerful in terms of how a business can go to market. It empowers you as an employee to perform really highly, but also brings with it challenges around, if you are an individualist, you're going to struggle to be told what to do. And sometimes what comes with brand and what comes with structure around marketing, professionals can feel that they're being constricted by what the marketing team, the business development team, the organisation as a whole is coming. Do you see that in your work?
I do, and I see reasons for people operating in an individual way. I mean, targets is a good example, but also we've seen people operate in almost in a very individualistic way in terms of their own referrers, their own team, their own department, or perhaps geographically their own office. And nobody's really been looking at it and questioning it. I think as we've seen more services move online and more organisations develop a presence and a brand presence, in particular online, then the expectation of how an organisation operates and the culture associated with that has to be reinforced through the actual interaction with the fee-earning team and the support team in particular. And often the support team are actually ignored in that respect as well. So we can see departmental variation, we can see geographical variation, and to a certain extent, you can see hierarchical variation as well. So, are people looking at it? Yes, they are. Are they looking at it as deeply as they should be? Probably not.
I think that starts to lean into strategy, but just to stay on culture for a moment, we have talked before about the Peter Drucker quote about culture eating strategy for breakfast. When you think about that phrase, what are your thoughts that come to mind? What have you seen?
I think we take it all the way back to the reality of working with a law firm, is that even now, with so much online and so much emphasis on digital, a lot of work comes in through reputation and referral. So the client experience is perhaps the most dominant factor in an organisation's ability to win work. So if those cultural factors and that kind of attention to client care is not at the very front of everybody's thinking, then the ability to deliver a strategy is going to be massively compromised.
So you've started to touch there a little bit on digital and also on relationship management. And that's quite an interesting balance for law firms, many businesses, but professional services in particular, when that referral channel is so strong. How do you see that as it is at the moment, digital and personal in-person relationships? And how do you see that balance changing or evolving over the next couple of years?
Well, I think we're looking at it in a lot more depth now, and the separation between different legal services is something that we should bear in mind. And it might be for one department they only need 10 clients a year, perhaps 10 new clients, and maybe hanging on to 20 existing clients, and that's fine. Thanks very much, and we've had a great year. But maybe for the more consumer-facing departments, the numbers game is in a different league completely. So their reputation and presence and brand values and to a certain extent differentiation is something which is communicated through digital channels typically. However, there's always going to be referral from happy clients or from good referral sources as well. If we take it through to the B2B side of things, that maybe the more corporate services, the website in particular operates in a slightly different way. Often people have been referred, or somebody has a reputation, and maybe they're existing in Legal 500 or Chambers and have an established reputation that's been reported on. But people will then use the website for verification purposes, and we should never underestimate just how important websites are for verification. And places like LinkedIn, for example, are regularly used by people who've been referred to verify the capability of an individual fee earner. And unfortunately, some very capable lawyers ignore their profiles, and they ignore their profile on their existing site, their firm site, let alone on LinkedIn. So they're missing an opportunity. And often it's not a case of how much work have we won through the website, but how many referrals have we lost that we've never heard about, because actually we don't have the content there that people are looking for.
And you touched on some key differences there in terms of what we'd call B2B and B2C, about education and affirming the quality of a brand versus the message to get people to buy, which often sits in a more B2C. What kind of trends are you seeing in websites in particular at the moment? Because that's a space you've been very successful in supporting law firms with. And best practice of websites is always changing. So how are law firms keeping up?
Well, there's a couple of things I think people are looking at in a way that perhaps have not looked at in the past. The first one is, how are they performing in terms of search? And there's a lot of discussions about search engine optimization. Some of that's quite technical, some of it's not quite technical. It's about content, but also looking at actually what we can do in terms of campaign management online. All the way through to some very, very niche activity, whereby we've seen, certainly the last 18 months, people struggling to get good quality people into their organisations. And things like LinkedIn can provide a tremendous opportunity for highly focused campaigning from a recruitment perspective as well. And it's a sort of thing whereby you can identify people by experience levels, location, if you really wanted to, and we have done some of this work in America actually, by firm. So targeting organisations by individuals by the organisation that they work in. So it's a fast-moving area.
And you're touching on a real sort of hot topic for all businesses, but in a marketing space particular, because for me, marketeers have very unique skills in terms of acquiring interest, retaining talented individuals, and also looking at how you can ensure people recognise the value of your organisation to them within their career pathway. And I think that's a real space that we've all got to get stronger at moving into, because similar to the business development type process and funnels that we talk about very often, getting a good recruit can be very similar. When you have a vacancy, you have a direct reason to approach people, but all the time those people are out there in your space. What are you doing to make yourself the most attractive employer? Whether they're looking for a job or whether it's not on their radar at all, I think marketeers can do a lot more to drive that. And I suppose that comes on to another big part of our conversations to date, and what would be good to explore here is, what are the key obstacles in law firms to marketing strategy? Because we've talked about a few ways that marketing massively impacts your opportunity for growth and sustainable growth. What are the big obstacles that you're seeing in firms at the moment?
I still think we've got an understanding issue. I think there is a perception that marketing is a case of running a few events, getting some newsletters out, and helping out with the website, as opposed to actually looking at what are the factors that are influencing the success of the firm. That might be something as specific as artificial intelligence and the challenges that's going to pose for the profession. It could be something a little bit more general in terms of what's going on with the competitors in the marketplace. And those competitors might be outside of the legal sector. It could be other organisations moving in, whether it be online services or otherwise, and actually having a much more all-encompassing marketing view. So the understanding of the strategic process and the marketing's role within that is compromised through a lack of understanding. We also have quite a lot of firms that have got people who have evolved into a marketing role and don't necessarily have, say, Chartered Institute of Marketing training behind them. So inevitably their understanding of the processes and how they all fit is compromised through understanding.
And another thing that I see in that space is a difficulty in finding core marketeers. So people who have an understanding of marketing, but an understanding of the whole. And I think the digitization has almost tripped ourselves up in that way, because you will specialize in digital. You can specialize in digital, which is a marketing channel, but don't necessarily have the wider skill set to explain value at a board level. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of people who work in marketing and professional services, is where they've come from to land in professional services, but also what skills they have and how to communicate that value in terms of growth, in terms of client retention, in terms of opportunity, and in terms of the employee piece, as we've just talked about.
Yeah, and I think if it's very easy for us to drop into fads as well. We've talked about digital, and it's a fundamentally important multi-layered channel. But often people will fall into it because it provides some data, not necessarily because it's always effective. So a good example of that is people sending out email newsletters. We as marketers see open rates typically falling. So into a cold contact, somebody new to the organisation we're trying to have a conversation with, you may get 5% open rates. With existing clients, you might see 30, 40, if you're very lucky, 50%. Well, that either means you're 95% ineffective, or you're 50% effective in either your lead generation activity or your communications to your ongoing clients. And are we really happy with those levels of success rates? Well, no, we can't be. But because it's easy, and because we've, to a certain extent, always done it, we drop into it. What we need to be doing is questioning some of our channels and our delivery methodology, and saying, well, what's the best way to do this?
I think that's a really important point about data, because data is brilliant and should aid good decision making, but it can also be something that you fall back on when instinctive connections drive what marketeers do best. And digital has brought that. It's brought us brilliant data. It's allowed us to bring excellent database systems, CRM systems. It's allowed us to grow audiences in a really organic and sustainable way. But in doing so, we're also almost eliminating some of that ability that marketeers have to spot opportunity and pull that opportunity closer into your organisation. Do you see much big data use in your work?
I wouldn't call it big data. Realistically, unless you're dealing with a very large organisation, the data isn't as big as maybe a lot of big data type organisations would refer to. I'm seeing a lot more emphasis on data, and in particular the relationship between the practice management system and marketing activity. And we've seen problems associated with taking data out of a practice management system. And often it comes down to the fact that the practice management system is set up to generate bills and not necessarily to help the marketing team. Often there are systems that allow us to get around that, but at some stage there's often some manual rework. So there's a little bit of fumbling going on still. But what I do think we can do is adopt a Pareto approach, whereby we say, okay, who do we need to talk to? How do we need to talk to them? And actually, by looking at a particular database, it might be a relatively small database. Actually, we can reach 80% of the people we want to talk to.
To summarise what we've talked about and to pick up on your points there, if I was the managing director of a legal firm, what would you be advising me is the most important thing for me to address?
So I think I would have a look at the role that marketing strategy plays within the broader strategy of the firm. I'd start at the strategic objectives for the whole firm and just be quite clear what they are, and base that on more than just forecasting, financial forecasting and departmental budgets. And then from that, ask either the internal team or external specialists to help deliver that strategy. So much marketing doesn't seem to be there to deliver strategy. And I think if you can have joined up thinking between the overall strategy for the firm and the activity of the marketing team and support organisations, then you've got a much, much better chance of getting to where you want to be.
I think that's really strong, and also identifying that across all of those disciplines where strategy can lead the way, within each of them there may not be a marketeer, but there is always a go-to-market element, and as you say, embracing those skills internally and potentially externally to help you achieve that goal. Yeah, very good. So drifting on from that into client acquisition, into new business, we've talked about how strong client relationships build over time. You've touched on the idea of cross referrals and opportunities in that way. But where do you see new business coming from for the legal sector?
I think it varies enormously firm to firm based on their service mix as much as anything else. But I think the start point is to say, where does the business come from? And it'd be quite interesting actually for some marketers to actually hear the results of that analysis. So for a lot of firms still, they might be getting 70 to 80% of their turnover from existing client base. A lot of that might be driven by a very small number of very good referrers. And other forms of client acquisition may be coming in more general digital channels. But actually having an understanding of that will then determine the business development objectives for the firm. So for some very commercial firms, maybe it's a case of getting on more tender lists. For more general firms, it might be a case of broadening your perception within a local marketplace. For mixed firms, it could be a combination of both of those, or it might be stimulating more from existing referral sources. And I think that's where it begins to break down. So just picking up on referral, it's almost like a taken bit of knowledge that work comes from referrers. But what we don't see much of is business development plans around referrers. So say, for example, you were generating, 15, 20 referrals from XYZ bank, but you only know 3 people within XYZ bank. Well, it'd be perfectly reasonable as part of a business development objective to say we need to know 20 people within XYZ bank and actually allocate responsibility to individual fee earners to develop those relationships and actually secure new opportunities. So I think looking at source of business and then linking that to real life activity is the way forward.